Save on O'Reilly Brake Parts Cleaner. Get 2 cans of O'Reilly Brake Parts Cleaner for just $8. Valid in-store only at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Welcome to Heritage Voices, episode 20. I'm Jessica Yaquinto, and I'll be your host today. And today we are talking about the Seneca-Iroquois National Museum. Before we begin, I'd like to honor and acknowledge the Nooch or Ute peoples on whose treaty lands I'm recording today, as well as the many other tribes with ancestral and cultural connections to this land, including the fact that this land is part of the ancestral Puebloan homeland and the Dinétah. On today's episode, we have David L. George-Shongo Jr., Acting Director of the Seneca-Iroquois National Museum. Dave is a lifetime resident of the Seneca Nation of Indians Allegheny Territory. He graduated from St. Lawrence University with a BA in anthropology. As a teenager, his first employment was with the Seneca-Iroquois National Museum, SINM, as a part-time tour guide after school. During college, he did several internships with SINM. For one of these internships, he participated in inquiring about the sacred and religious items in the museum's collections from across the United States, which needed to be repatriated under NAGPRA, or the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990. Dave has worked as an adjunct professor at Jamestown Community College, teaching physical and cultural anthropology. He's also worked as the staff archaeologist for the Seneca Nation of Indians Tribal Historic Preservation Office, or TIPO. He was the first archivist of the Seneca Nation, and he became the first chairperson of the Society of American Archivists Native American Archives Roundtable in 2005. In 2007, Dave served in the SAA's Mentor Program and the Task Force on the Protocols for Native American Archival Materials. In 2009, he received the Excellence in Archives Award from the National Conference for Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums. Most recently, he was employed with the Men's Cultural and Ritual Language Program, a program dedicated to ensuring the ongoing practice of traditional teachings, arts, knowledge, and the living cultures of our Longhouse ways. So welcome to the show, David.
Thank you. You always can't go this way and again when they said it. Greeted you all in my language. Said hello. Thank you for you all being here.
And you guys just had a very exciting event at the Seneca-Iroquois National Museum. So do you want to start out real quick talking about what just happened?
Yeah, this last Saturday, about 3 days ago, we transitioned to the new cultural center. And we're just one of 2 departments that are in there. It's the museum, but also our Seneca Nation Archives department. And so the reason we picked the date was that the current museum had been founded in August 1st, 1977. And so we went with August again because it would be 40 years in the old place, the 41st year. We started in a new building. And so it was quite successful. We had around 1,500 people. A lot of people speaking from our president, treasurer, our board, myself, and the archivist for the Seneca Nation. So, and as we have transitioned, our new building is 3 times bigger than our current, our past building now. I guess it's not our current building. But it's all made state of the art. We put in 3 times as much fiber optics as we thought we would need because we were looking at doing like e-tours and really using technology. The building is all has everything from humidity control to the lights and security. And so I'm really excited because it's the first time in our history of our nation that we've had such a facility that can take care of everything with our history and our collections.
Yeah.
We even have a contaminated area and contaminated lab area. And so in case something happens, we can just bring somebody here or have somebody on staff. to tend to those things.
And I'm not sure how many of our listeners are familiar with what you're talking about, but can you talk about why a contamination area might be necessary?
Oh, over the years, sometimes some of the papers and some of the items might have gotten mold on them. And so we have to quarantine them away from the other items so it doesn't contaminate the whole collection. As a group of collections, we have just a little under 11,000 items. But if I count every shared, every pottery share and stuff, then we're responsible for more than 1 million items. So we do our best to make sure that anything that is contaminated, maybe it's like a corn husk or maybe it's a basket. We usually work with Buff State, their conservation department, and work with their grad students to tend to things in our collection. But with the new facility, we can quarantine those things off and hire a conservator to come right in to repair those items.
And I mean, I don't know if you guys have had that issue, but I know that some of the tribes out here have had issues with things like previous museum work using substances like arsenic for preservation, and that also has been a contamination issue. Is that something that you guys have faced?
Yes, we have the same issues with that. Some of our sacred masks have been contaminated with arson. Some of our other things especially that are made of wood, were contaminated with arson. Luckily, we did try to minimize that and hired a person, like I said, working with Buff State and their conservation department. You can never take it all out. I mean, it's ingrained into it, and so, but we try to minimize it the chemicals. So that's one of the new things too, is that with us having a state-of-the-art building, we have everything, like I said, from lighting to humidity to temperature control within the building. So we've been discussing a lot of things with different museums and historical societies in New York and in Pennsylvania. And so we're looking at repatriating a lot of things because some of our counterparts, that they're not as fortunate as we are now and don't really have the facilities to properly take care of things. And so the building we just are moving into, we're fortunate that the Seneca Nation was able to pay $18 million or put up $18 million for this building.
Wow.
And so we didn't borrow any money from anywhere else. It just came from our own hard work and financial responsibility that the tribal members or the council and executives do to make sure that we have money in order to do this.
Wow.
And so I don't know if anybody knows Kurt Jordan from Cornell University, but we have a contract with him for his Tawny Reed and for his White Plains archaeological site. And so probably by before the end of this year, we'll end up having that collection repatriated back to us. And so to me, that's really exciting. That's more over by Rochester, New York, where the Ganunagant was a town. And the site that he's looking at is a time when it's supposed to be really poor for my ancestors. And you can see that these towns were not poor. And that it was, I guess it's sort of like now, people say that we're in a recession or we're in a depression. But people that lived through the 1940s, when there was a real depression, wouldn't consider us in a depression. So, there's a few other things from the site that I'm interested in looking at more when we get them back. I didn't know that my ancestors had they worked with glass. And so they had gotten some rum bottles and some other things that were glass that was from the French. And they manipulated them and made them into jewelry. And so I had no idea until the site that we even had a history of working with glass.
How long ago was this excavation?
It just within the last 5 years, it's been going on.
Okay.
And so his grad students have been putting all the things together with the metadata and all that's going on. And so when it transfers over to us, then it fits right into our system.
Okay. And was this something that the tribe was working on with him?
Yeah, we've had some of our students go up there, high school students, just to see what an archaeological site looks like. As you mentioned, part of my background is going to St. Lawrence and having an anthropology degree. So we always try to encourage that with our students to see what our ancestors did and how traditions have changed or kept the same. And so even some of our people have gone to Cornell and are on the site.
So, okay, before I cut you off, you were talking about the glass, and then you mentioned the pottery and.
Yeah, just the things that they're working on and the things that they're finding through the pots is helping us with our traditions and looking at how we can maybe bring things back that we had sort of forgot, that was a tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe retooling it. It's like, technology changes, people change with technology, and I just want to see how they incorporated some of the things that they did in their everyday life. Going and being in anthropology, sometimes, anthropologists will say, well, they're not really native anymore because they're using metal instead of using stones. And I don't believe that at all.
Right.
I mean, if we look at today's society and stuff, like my church probably was made in China, but that doesn't make me Chinese or less native.
Yes.
My cars, Toyota, and so just because I'm driving a Japanese car, it doesn't make my traditions any less. I mean, just like anybody else,
Right. Right. Well, I'm certainly not doing the same things that my ancestors did a couple generations back, so I don't know why the expectation for anybody else would be any different. I'm not wearing the same clothes and keeping my head covered and doing all those things, eating kosher. I mean, cultures adapt and they're flexible, and I think it's a sign of resilience, not lack. That's for sure.
Yeah. Within our own people, we always feel as though we have adapted to different things. And even like with our language, there's stories about a huge guis. Nowadays, we call a guis a pig, but sounds like in these stories, it's probably an animal that was 20,000 years ago. And now we realize that through some archaeological sites that they found some mammoths by Randolph. And so when my ancestors saw the hog, the boar, it has the tusk, and so we're using the same word that they use for a mammoth for a pig now. And so I think that's interesting in itself, and that's part of what we've done with the new cultural center, and is teaching our youth that our language is old, and just because we change the way we look at an animal, we're still using those names. There's quite a few things that are like that.
Wow.
Gachonsi Ta is what we traditionally would call a certain kind of dragon that was white. It's sort of like the never-ending story. I don't know if you ever watched that, but there's a dragon in there that looks like a dog or looks like a lion. And so Gachonsi Ta is what we use for a lion because of about the mane and the hair it has and stuff. So
wow, interesting. How common is it for people at Seneca-Iroquois to speak the language?
Well, there was a time when the language was going down, just like everybody else, because of the boarding schools, and we've had a more of a resurgence lately. My wife now is a appellate court judge, but before she was elected in November, she worked in an immersion program. So from 9 o'clock to 5 o'clock every day, she would speak our own native language. And she got to be so proficient in it that even now we both dream in the language.
Wow.
Sometimes it's in Seneca, sometimes it's in English. I think I forgot to mention in my bio that I used to work for Gwanda High School and I used to teach our native language. And so sometimes the kids would ask me, the students would ask me, well, how come you can't, translate this word or translate this? And I said, well, it's like any other languages. Some things just don't translate into each other.
Right.
For example, the word just. How do you explain just? That just happened. That's just not right. You know how to use them, but explaining them is totally different. Plus, sometimes, like for myself, using a native language is much more descriptive, and we have spatial recognitions that we don't have in English. And so, to me, speaking English is sort of like watching a 2D movie, where speaking native is more like watching a 3D movie. And that's the best I can explain how that is. You just can tell like how far something is, close to you, above, top. If it's laying down. And so it's much more enriched.
It's like the IMAX version.
Well, even like the building, we named it after a head faith keeper, spiritual leader within our community. His name was English name was Richard Johnny John. His Indian name was Anoso Gwandit, and that means like an opening into the house. And so when I was giving the speech last Saturday, I said, well, we're opening our culture to the world. And that was part of the reason we named the building after him. Mm-hmm. But even in English, like we call it cultural center, but we don't really have that kind of concept of culture in the same as anthropology. So I had thought about it. I mean, we have we call it like an Indian way, but it's not the same as anthropology. Mm-hmm. And so I thought if I was describing it in my language, it would be like Anundawat Ka Nicole Hendwawajentoke. Nundawat is what we call ourselves. The Ka means that kind type. Nicole means here in this realm. And then Hendwawajentoke, the game makes it in a certain spot, almost like GPS it. And the Hendwawajenta is like taking a fishing hook and throwing it from this realm into the spiritual realm and pulling into this realm what it means to be a Nundawat God. So that's how I would describe it in my language, and how, like I said, to me, that's more of a 3D perception of how I can picture it better in my mind anyways than just saying cultural.
Right. There's a lot more depth to it in the original.
Yes.
All right. Well, we are amazingly already at our first break. So we will be back here in a few moments.
Back to school savings are officially in session at Tanger Outlets. Shop the latest school styles with an extra 25% off during Tanger Style, our biggest sale of the season, now through August 25th. Plan your trip at tanger.com.
You're so coy, alluring, angel with a wicked smile, sleeping 20 hours a day, never lay a paw on dusty clay. I'll keep your litter natural, no chemicals in your nostrils, just corn below, so every time you go you'll know your don't stink. World's best cat litter for the world's best cat.
All right, we are back. Okay, so I wanted to make sure that we started out talking about the museum and the museum opening, since that was a big, exciting event that just happened this last Saturday, which, let's see, that's August 4th, although the rest of you won't be hearing this until later in the month. But now I want to go back and give everybody a little bit more of a background on who you are and how you got here. So you mentioned that you got an anthropology BA. What inspired you to do that? How did you end up in this field at all?
Oh, like it says in my bio, I started working at the museum when I was 14. And so I like culture. I like listening to people, why they do stuff and why they don't do it this way, and interacting with people. And I've heard an Indian joke about the reason that natives say how to non-natives is when the non-natives first came here, they were asking the natives, well, how do you do this? Or how do you do that? Or how did that happen? And so my ancestors got together and said, well, that how word must be really significant to them. And so they thought, well, next time we see them, we'll say how.
There you go.
Yeah. That's just a little native sense of humor, just.
Yes.
But that's, to me, part of the reason why I got into this. It was, people would come into our community and try to change us or think that they were helping us by changing who we are and making us more advanced. And so as I've looked at things more through anthropology, and we did things that are probably more advanced than other people realize. And so some of the things that is coming about, and to me, that's a good way. And having this new cultural center, we're just showcasing some of these ways that we deal with the earth. For example, like if we look at genetics, right? They have to go through the mother in order to do your genes to see who you're related to. Well, our clan system is on the women. And so we decide, it's in the blood or it's in the genes. And so we don't really look at the men's side too much, but it's more of the women that we look at. And for us, women are the backbone of our society. And so there's other things like our Thanksgiving address, and we give thanks to everything that's in nature. But it's also our environmental philosophy. And so when we're looking at how to deal with nature, we realize that we're a part of nature. Even in our thought process about like a twice hat, the soul, the spirit, part of us is from the physical part of the earth. Part of it's from the sky world, the heaven, I guess, if you wanted to call it that. But also a part of us is linked to the spirit of this planet. And so when I worked in men's traditional society there, before becoming the museum director, we talked about Red Mars, a graphic novel, and natives being born in Mars. And we said, well, would they be Ungwe, which in our language means like a human being? And we ended up thinking, no, they wouldn't be. They wouldn't be us because they wouldn't have the spirit of this planet. They would have the spirit of that planet. And so that would make them a different thing.
Mm-hmm.
So all my life, ask questions, listen to stories. And so it just was, when I was young, I was going to be a native lawyer, but like everybody else that goes to college, you have one thing in mind and you pick, 20 different topics or how you're going to graduate. And in the end, I just loved cultural anthropology more than linguistics or physical anthropology. And so that was mostly what my degree is in cultural anthropology. And so to me, a lot of my jobs have dealt with that. Even when I worked in Tippo, we would go on to archaeological site and then we'd look at it and try to see like what we would interpret the history to be. And so one of the things I remember was we go to Painted Post and you go 17 here on the highway and go out to Painted Post and you go south into Pennsylvania. There was an archaeological site there in which they found a couple of longhouses and turtle pits. And I had heard about the turtle pits and that we used to use them for sweats. And so one of the turtle pits, I'm about 6'2" and weigh around 280 anyways. that turtle pit was so big that I could fit 20 of my size guys into it. And so that was the first time I ever seen anything of that nature. And, talking to the elders, not just in my community, but, Six Nations, which is in Canada, that's what they said. Well, it was a sweat, and that people used to purify themselves. And when they didn't use it for that, then they used it to store their food away and stuff. So in the end, they were making a highway going through that area, and so we weren't able to preserve it. But now it has all this dirt that's over top of it, has a geoplate in case somebody in the future ever digs there, they'll at least know that something is important there, and that the highway is over it now, so I'm not too worried about anybody getting at it. But we do have a diorama of that site, and so it's cut into layers. And so some people, without reading the description, they'll think, well, the bottom layers are a couple hundred years before the top layer. And some of them will think, well, the poor Indians are in the little hut, and the more rich Indians are in the longhouses. And we point out to them, like, no, that was a hunting ground, and then a couple, 100 years later, a couple families live there, and a couple hundred years later, then it becomes like a whole village, even to the point that it looked like it was a town, because I wouldn't consider a couple thousand people a village. I would consider that more of a town.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just interesting to see some of the way that they were interacting where the posts are, because one of the posts was a little off. And so you could just tell that it was probably just a human error. We all make mistakes, and they probably just made a mistake there in that section, and we worked it out. And as we learned more about our longhouses, we realize now that our architectural design is different than European design. Like, our longhouses are made for winter, and the weight is distributed in the middle, so it's very unlikely for the roof to cave in. Where when we moved into log cabins, it was more of a way that they could the roof could fall in because of the snow that we get here. So there's a lot of adaptability that was into our way of life and the environment that we were living, even to the point where there was a trail tree that wasn't very far from that area. And so I don't know if you listeners have ever heard of a trail tree, but a native trail tree is basically like a destination sign. My ancestors used to bend the trees in certain ways, and then they would know which way the path was. If there was a bump in the tree, there was water on that side of the path, or there was sort of slits in it, you would know if there was like a sacred spot over there, or you could just read the tree and be able to give you all the information that you needed.
Man, it's so funny that you mentioned this today, because I was just sharing yesterday an article about, so there's a bit of controversy out here in Colorado about so-called Ute prayer trees. They were calling them prayer trees, though, not trail trees. Basically, unlike you guys, the Utes didn't have that same tradition of bending and shaping trees and things like that, more because they were more, constantly moving through the landscape and stuff like that. So they didn't, spend time in one place tending to one tree and things like that. So there's somebody out here in Colorado who has been basically taking, like, he's proclaimed himself to be the expert on Ute prayer trees, and the tribes have been asking him to stop. Like, this is not something that our tribe does. This is something that other tribes do. And so it's just really interesting, like, that you mentioned this today, just because it's really been at the forefront of my mind. Just like that, there's really like a an appropriation happening there and something that the tribe's fighting against. Whereas like for you guys, that actually is something that is part of your tradition. So it's just a interesting juxtaposition hearing you talk about that. And I can include the article about the Utes fight in the show notes in case anyone's interested in learning more.
Yeah. Well, what I like about it is that it shows that we were interacting with the environment, that we weren't just being passive with the environment, just letting trees grow wherever. A lot of times, if you look at how the villages are, you'll look around the trees that are around the village now. Buff State, their archaeological department has been looking at the type of trees around our villages, and they realize that a lot of the trees are hardwood. And so being hardwood, they're harder to burn. And so it has to be a way that my ancestors just knew if they had those hardwoods around and, forest fire happens, it gives us more time to get away. That there's just a lot of thought pattern that's going on and manipulating the environment, but also at the same time working with the environment.
Mm-hmm.
So we're starting to get those things back and understanding how our ancestors did stuff that we can appropriate into like our forestry or our conservation department within our nation and bring. To me, those are traditions, those are history that we can reclaim. And so as we reclaim that kind of history, we reclaim some of our own sovereignty and by understanding who we are as a people.
And I guess on that note, I'm definitely curious to learn more about this men's cultural and ritual language program that you were working on. It sounds like it ties into some of what you're just talking about, maybe.
Yeah, the men's ceremony, we make sure that all our traditions within the longhouse, which is like our spiritual gathering place, is maintained. So there's certain speeches and certain doings that we do in order to maintain to be a healthy person. So, like for me, I was good at giving speeches, so I didn't always try to learn a speech. When I was there, I tried to learn songs because I'm not good at songs. It was more challenging for me. So as I learned certain songs, when people realized that, oh, well, he is learning something. If I gave a speech, they're like, oh, well, he's given speeches before.
Right.
But these speeches are like funeral speeches, or like me and my wife, when we got married, married our own native way. And so like part of what I did was I went and got a deer to show that I could provide for the family. And she used corn wheel and put berries in there so that it would show that she would poodle for the children and tending to the children. We had wedding baskets, and John Doe is an elder within our community's English name is Clayton Logan. John Doe means something like a big tree in a certain spot. But he did our ceremony anyways. And it's about a 45-minute speech about responsibilities to each other and to the community and to our families. And that's what some of the people like in that's one of the things where because of misunderstanding, or maybe because of Christianity trying to put some stuff down, like she'll call me Haganti and I'll call her Kaganti. And what it translates into English is my old lady or my old man, which doesn't sound right in English, but in our own native language, what we're saying is that her thoughts or my thoughts should be greater than our own generation and should be treated as elders. And so it's almost like in English to be like a better half. But because Christianity didn't want to recognize our kind of marriage, when we spoke of that way, they were like, well, that's not a real marriage because it wasn't a Christian marriage. And so some of the stereotypes or prejudice, I guess, against us makes it sound that way, that it's not the right thing. So when I worked at men's ceremony, that's what we looked at, is how we can keep in contact with with the environment. And to us, like in our language, we don't have a word for religion. It's just the life. It's just the way you live your life as a human being. And so, like, the first thing that we're taught is, like how I introduce, Nyawiskeno. Basically, I'm asking a question, do you have peace within you, or are you healthy? And if you're not healthy, then it's up to us to take care of each other and to put people at a good mind. And so that's why I had liked being down there, just to keep myself in a good mind. But I was asked by some of our tribal counselors, our Seneca Nation counselors, if I would take this role as being the director of the museum because of making the new cultural center. Since I was the first archivist of the Seneca Nation, I had already a reputation of starting a program new and letting it flourish. So I've had the honor of starting this new building with the archives and with the museum. And so I see it from both points of view. And I'm just glad after 40 years that we've had this, because the museum, like I said, was built in 1977, and it was supposed to be only a temporary spot for 5 years. And within the 5 years, they were supposed to make a new building. And there's been several different attempts. I think we were the 9th architectural design that it finally happened. And so when you come into the museum, there's certain things that we do, like for us, life goes counterclockwise and death goes clockwise. And so when we're doing the exhibit, the tours on the exhibit, we make sure that the path is counterclockwise and going with life.
Yeah.
And so that's why we're calling it a cultural center. Museums, a lot of times now for us here, we think of it as more just the past and not the future.
Right.
And so with our exhibits, we start with our creation story. And then the last exhibit is a projection onto the walls of what our children in our community think Senecas will be like in 40 to 100 years from now. And so they drew them all out. And so we have a projection on that wall of 10 screens, and it shows what the future of Senecas will be.
Oh, I love that.
Well, it's more like a dream state too. So even if the kids didn't draw everything, realistically, it didn't matter.
Right.
You didn't pick anybody, what they think is what's going to happen. We wanted to acknowledge that. So within our time capsule, because we did it in 40 years, we have a date on the time capsule saying in 2058, 40 years from now, that they would open up that time capsule and see those pictures and other articles of what happened on the opening of this new cultural center.
Man, okay. On that note, we are at our second break again. So we will be right back, and then we are going to dig more into this museum.
Okay.
All right. See you in a minute.
Chicken tacos should only be trusted to chicken professionals.
That's where we come in. Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One comes with pico de gallo and creamy chipotle ranch. And the other comes with bacon, lettuce, tomato, and avocado ranch. Chicken experts since 1990. Chicken taco experts since now. Order yours today in the Zax Rewards app. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.
Okay, and we are back. So, okay, there's so many places to go with all of this, but the first thing that I want to talk about is something that you mentioned actually when we were on break off the air real quick, which was just about the process of developing a museum like this. You're talking about, basically how do you design a museum, cultural center, I should say, to represent you as a people. And this is something that Lyle and Susan and Marissa talked about on episode 10. They're trying to tackle these very same issues with the Hopi Museum and Learning Center that they're trying to develop. So I would be curious, first of all, in hearing about what that process was like in figuring out how you wanted to do this entire cultural center and do it right, so people felt like it really represented them. But then also, like, what advice would you have for other tribes that are trying to build their own museums, or just other museums in general, I guess?
Well, as we were discussing a little bit, I was the first Seneca Nation tribal archivist. And so when I designed that, there were no policies, there weren't no procedures. And I looked at what archives was, because I don't like doing things that doesn't have anything to do with our language or outside our language. And so as I kept looking at things, I realized that the National Archives that people were trying to compare us to started during or after the Civil War. And it was at the garage next to the White House. And 150 years later, they developed what we know as the National Archives.
Yeah.
So that helped me reshape the way I looked at everything within our own way of being and stuff. For example, within our archives, we have things that are maybe sacred to us or traditional to us. For example, we have the Dong song or the morning song. And I know with some of my colleagues that were non-native, they have a policy that, information is always available. Well, for us, if somebody wanted to listen to the Dong song and the morning song, they had to come in the morning. It's not an afternoon song. It's not a night song.
Mm-hmm.
And so some of my non-native colleagues, they were like, well, you have to open it up to everybody. We have this policy. And they were talking about a records management policy of, having it available to everybody. I said, well, the records management policy that you're citing is maybe 50 years old. I said, maybe it's 100 years old. We'll go that far. It's not anything more than 100 years old. And they agreed. I said, so you want me to change something that my people have been doing for millennia because of this policy for 100 years? And they were like, And so it was just those kind of ways of looking at things from different points of view. And so I think this is where my cultural anthropology background comes into play, to look at things in many different ways. And that's what we're just doing with our museum, is that we designed it or made it more Senecanized, I guess is the way to describe it.
I love that, Senecaized.
Because we made it our own. For example, we have an NEA grant, a National Endowment of Arts grant for 3D printers. We have 3 3D printers and 1 huge 3D printer. Well, we figured that we would just use that technology in order to do technological cultural camps. And so one of the things is we were looking at seeing like making a basket, but making the handle out of the 3D printer. How can we take these tools that we have nowadays and apply them to old tools? Reminds me of my good friend Steve Corden, who's a counselor now. He was making a face medicine mask, and he was using a chainsaw. And the anthropologist at the time was like, well, your ancestors wouldn't have used a chainsaw. He looked at him and said, well, if there was a chainsaw around, they would have used it.
Yeah, exactly.
The anthropologist looked at him and was like, yeah. I think, once, and so when I went around, I told people, like, we don't have to make the buildings square, we can make them curved. Like one of our walls on our museum is curved, just to make it our own way of architectural design. Mm-hmm. And so when we looked at this building and looked at where we were putting everything, our past museum, I guess, was only 10,000 square feet. And our current museum now is 33,000 square feet. So it's 3 times bigger. Mm-hmm. But we wanted to make sure that we had technological things in there to bring the kids in, but at the same time, keep them going on with our traditions. We might take a log and pound splints off the log. Are we using a stone axe that my ancestors would have used a long time ago? No. We're using a metal axe, more convenient, but at the same time, our youth are learning, that it's not easy to make a basket or make pottery. Mm-hmm. And that in order to do all these things, that we need the whole, every generation in order to do those things. Usually the good pot makers are older people. Well, they can't go out and get the clay because they're too old to do that. So then they'll train somebody young on how to get the clay or what to get the clay or what kind of type of clay. And so things are just passed down through that way of knowing. And so it keeps the traditions more alive that way. And so that's why we were trying to go over the cultural center, because we don't want people just feeling as though we're just of the past and we're only stuck in the past. And so my advice to, my other Native people is, look at how things can be done, but keep an inventive way of in doing it, that if we look at our customs and traditions, we do have science, we have philosophies. And if we can maintain those at the same time advancing, to me, it's the best of both worlds.
And it sounds like, you're talking about how your traditions take all of the generations. It sounds like you guys did that with the museum as well, basically with incorporating the kids into the future part and then looking at, the traditions and stuff. What kind of engagement was there with the community during this process of designing the museum?
There was a lot of engagement. A lot of the exhibits are community projects. And so, like we did the Canonia, the Thanksgiving address. And so we did workshops. Instead of just hiring one artist to do the beadwork, we engaged people just to come in and make a leaf out of the beads, the plastic beads. Or we did like strawberries. That's important to us. And people made felt strawberries. Or what was another? There were quite a few different projects that we used anyways that was with the whole community. And so even now, like you were saying, with like the youth, I remember one of my friends, their nephew, who's 9 years old, was telling his whole family, well, you got to go to the new museum because my stuff is in there. And that's what we wanted this is not just, somebody at the opening told me, oh, well, this is your building. And I said, no, this is not my building. I have the honor of tending to the building, but this is for our community and for our people. And all of our exhibits are made for our own people. And some people were telling me, like, oh, well, you have to make the exhibits for non-Native. And I said, no, I don't. That I'm making it for our own people. And if our own people have pride in it, then the rest of the world will have pride.
Which leads me to my next question. You mentioned at the beginning that also you wanted this facility to be a facility not only for your own tribe, but for your neighboring tribes who also might not have the curation facility in order to do the NAGPRA types of things that they want to do. Could you talk a little bit more about that aspect?
Well, if we can help each other out, we're going to help each other out. One of the exhibits we have is on the stars. And one of the stars that makes us where we lived in the chosen spot by Canandaigua was the holder of the sky. But then when I look at Navajo stories about how the Navajo and Zuni got there, it was with long sash, sorry. And long sash is the same stars that we talked about. So I thought that was very interesting. And so if we can help somebody and put some of their things for them in our facilities until they have their facilities to take care of that. My counselors have already recommended some of that process just to help each other out, like I said. So yeah, we're looking at a couple of communities, that are out west. It might not be as fortunate as to have this, but at the same time, already, a couple of different communities within the Haudenosaunee, within our own nation, has wanted to come and look at our facilities in order to see how they can duplicate some of the things. Like, for example, some of the things that we have getting back is like dead wampum. Dead wampum to us is wampum that's buried. And so looking at having a place where we bring the wampum back, but maybe bury it in the ground within a storage area, or keeping it within the ground. And then that way we can bring it back, but still maintain who we are and looking at respecting what our elders had done, or how we might use certain medicines with certain things. That's a big opponent. Some of the stuff that's been repatriated that I always looked at. I always thought that there should be some kind of warning label to people, whether it's within somebody's tradition is supposed to be for male or female, or how did the people do it. I remember being at Washington, D.C., and archaeologists or anthropologists had asked these native people if they could use their song to bring the ancestors back. And they granted them the permission to do that. Well, he played the song, but he only played half of it. And I'm like, well, what does that do to the ancestors? That put them in purgatory? Like, play the whole song. Yes, permission, but it just made sense to me that they meant the whole thing.
Right.
Just, but because he had permission, he just thought he could make it any way he wanted. And so quite a few of us that were native there convinced him to play the whole song. And then I was much better with it until I said, well, what's the song to take them back? And he was like, oh, I didn't get that one. And I was like, okay, well. It's just a way of different ways of thinking, I guess. I mean, I might did New York. Well, where my people are, is in New York State, and so I went to the New York State Museum, and they had this picture of a very fierce terrain. It was mountainous and stuff, and it was supposed to be from the early 1700s. And beyond that terrain, they said that in the caption, it said that my ancestors said that there were unicorns on the other side of that mountain. And as soon as I saw it, I started laughing. And the person that was the museum director was like, why are you laughing? I was like, it was probably a joke. Like, the person was probably coming around that was an explorer and was bothering everybody about unicorns. And instead of just like being mean about it, they looked around and were like, I bet you I can get him to climb that mountain. That it was the most rigorous mountain around, or whatever. And the other ones were like, no, you can't. And then they said, well, go that way for the unicorns. Don't come back this way. And 400 years later, it's supposed to be the truth. And I was just like, it was just a joke.
So I take it that nobody from that museum talked to the tribe about how they would want to be represented.
That's what we were there for, and it was very interesting. Because like one of the things that we did was we asked about our ancestors that they had and the human remains, and then they said, well, they needed to keep them for scientific purposes. And we said, oh, okay, well, when's the last time that you've done anything scientific with them? They said, oh, we had it. And I said, well, you've had our ancestors' remains for 100 years. Like, when's the deadline to say, like, okay, you've had them enough? If you haven't used them in 100 years for anything for scientific purposes, what's the justification? You know?
Right.
And then they're like, you know, so over the years, I've learned to, ask questions of that nature. Like, okay, you're using them from scientific purposes. Okay, when's the last time you did it? Or when's the future you're looking at? Or are you doing a grant now? And if they're not, then to me, it's not true then. It's just
right. It's just more of a hypothetically, we might at some point in the future want to do something. So we just want to keep them because we want them. I mean, it's not really, not really how NAGPRA works.
No. So, and then, my bio, I had worked with NAGPRA in the 90s and found out that, some of our sacred things was already in Hawaii. And then it just dawned on me, like, oh my goodness, if our stuff can be in Hawaii, it could be anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
Being a young man of 21, I just never thought about it in that way. I mean, I grew up on the territory here, and we didn't have a big community. We still don't have a big community, of like New York City or something like that, So when I got older and had more resources, finances, or whatever you want to say. I mean, I've traveled more and saw more of the country and more of the world than when I was young. When I was young, we went on vacation. That was just going over to the next reservation and visiting relatives. My daughter went to Disney World or Universal. That's vacation. So time, they change, but we just have to adapt to the way that we look at it and what it means to be native. I think is different in my daughter's age than it was in my age. Some people when I was young, they wore the headdresses like out west and not the costores that we wear. And so now we discuss that. Is that a tradition then, or is that just a custom, or what does that make that be? Because within that time period, that's what they did.
So I'd be curious then, since and man, we got to wrap up already, but let me ask you this at least. So you started working on NAGPRA stuff in the 90s, and you're still, it sounds like, doing some work on NAGPRA today. What kind of change have you seen in that, almost 30 years now? Or do you feel like that there hasn't been a lot of progress made?
Let me see. In some ways, I think there's been progress. It's opened up doors and conversations that wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the law. In other ways, I mean, it's hindered things. Some of our sacred things, like masks, they had medicine bundles on them, and so you hear reports of like museums taking off the medicine bundles and saying, well, this is not sacred. And so at a certain point, it was like, okay, well, we have to consider all sacred then, because we don't know who's tampered with what. And then you decide, deciding, it's not one person deciding, it's multiple people deciding. And having some conversations with the non-natives. What I noticed is that when we started actually having conversations, and they're like, well, you have 30 days in order to get this report back to us. And then we had a meeting, and I'm like, okay, there's like 300 of you sending me by myself reports, and I'm supposed to get them done in 30 days. That's not realistic. I mean, it's realistic for you, but that's not realistic for us. And then some of that has changed over the years, because they realize now, or we realize, that some of our stuff is out there that we just didn't realize how much was out there over the years. And so now we have to have conversations, can we really tend to all this stuff that's out there? Or how do we tend to it, And so in those ways, it's changed. Some of the ways that we deal with non-natives in these environments is that just because we disagree doesn't mean that we're unfriendly to each other. We're still friends at the end of the day, but we still, I believe, the ones I respect, I still respect. And the ones I didn't respect, I still don't I'm not mean to them, but
Right.
we don't have that. But to me, now that we have this new cultural center, a lot of the non-natives, because of NAGPRA in the 90s and us knowing each other, they're more willing to give us things back. Just like New York State just had the corn planter tomahawk peace pipe. Somebody stole it 70 years ago, and somebody just returned it to them like within the last month. And because they heard about our new cultural center and everything that's going along with it, they said they would like to return it back to us in January of next year and have it back home to us. And it wasn't for radio shows or podcasts like this. I don't know if they would have learned about our new facility. So this alone, to me will change the way some people think and how they interact with us. So I appreciate that you're giving me the opportunity to talk on your podcast.
Yeah, of course. Well, and I guess final question, and then if you want to, give any information about people on visiting the cultural center, etc., then you can finish out with that as well. But what would be the one thing that you would want people to take away from the cultural center, from the museum, from this episode, whatever? If people only took away one thing, like, that other podcast, what would you want that to be?
That we're human beings and that we're free, because even today, somebody came to me and their school had a native mascot. And she's like, well, our Indians. And I was like, well, hold on. What do you mean by our Indians? Like, you make it sound as though we're your possession or we're your slaves or something. And she's like, well, that's not what I mean. And I'm like, but that's kind of language that you're putting us in. You don't really see us as a true human being able to change and to adapt and just stereotyping us one way. So people that come through our cultural center, our new museum, that's what I hope they take away, is that just because I have shoes on and I don't have always feathers on doesn't make me less or more native. I'm still native without them. What makes me native is in my hearts and the way I present myself. And I choose to speak English because it's easier at this point instead of speaking our native language for the viewer. So, and so that's why I want them to take away with, and that's why we ended the tour in the future. Because once you walk out those doors, it's up to you to decide how you want to interact with us because you're in the future.
Right. Not just, tribes aren't just in the past. But man, that's really sad that the bar has to be so low for, you know what I mean? Like that. And I know I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but even in Tucson, for one of my classes in college, gave tours of the Arizona State Museum, and Tucson is a city with reservations literally within the city.
Yeah.
And then all around it. And it would be the same thing. Like people would be like, the kids would be like, oh, we're going back in time. So it's, even in a city like Tucson where there's, I don't know how you can miss it. You know what I mean? And yet there's still this perception. So it's sad that has to be like the goal of the museum, that it has to be that low. Just because of the surrounding, society. That's really too bad.
Even within our own community, changing how we do certain things. I talked to one of my cousins, anyways, and we're having a 400-seat amphitheater in the back that's outside, and I said, "Well, do you want to play?" Because he's in a band that does native blues, and he's like, "Well, I don't sing Indian songs." And I said, "Well, you Indian, right?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "You sing, right?" He said, "Yeah, I sing." I said, "Well, it must be Indian songs then. It's Indian music, you know."
Yep.
And he was like, "Oh yeah, it is Indian music, you know." So, but that's the thing with having a living cultural center. That yes, it might not be our social songs or something that we did in the 1600s, but it's still pertaining to our community. The songs that he does and with the native blues. To me, that's even changing within our own perception of who we are and stuff.
Right. Right. As opposed to the outside, like dance, Indian dance, Yeah. God. Okay. So you mentioned that there's going to be a new website for the museum. So we will have once by the time this launches, we can have that in the show notes. But is there any other information that you would want people to have about the museum, like how to visit or anything like that?
Well, we're on Facebook, so just look for Seneca-Iroquois National Museum. And one of the reasons I mention that is that we do some of our lecture series and we record them and then put them onto Facebook. And so whether you're in Tucson or whether you're in Florida, we have Senecas, our relatives all over the United States or all over the world, and they can look and interact with us on Facebook that way. And so we, FaceTime some of our lecture series. And so as the lecture series is going on, you can type in your questions and we can answer them. With the old museum, we didn't have the fiber optics to do that, but with the new building in a couple months here, we're going to start our lecture series, our fall lecture series. And then we'll do the spring lecture series. So I'm looking forward to actually having fiber optics in order to get these things out and so the wiring that we had. So look for us anyways in those avenues anyway.
Okay. And we can include the Facebook page on the show notes as well. All right. Any other way, or is that the main method that you want people to go for?
That's the main method right now. I got the youth looking at other stuff for us, but
nice. All right. Well, thank you again for coming on and sharing with all of us. We appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate being here, and in our language we say "esconge," until we see each other again.
Till we see each other again. This is Jessica, just jumping back in here real quick. Just to remind everybody that the fundraiser that Lyle and I talked about in our updates episode 19.1, for Living Heritage Research Council, our new nonprofit, it ends next Tuesday, the 28th. So right when you hear this episode, if you wouldn't mind going to www.custominc.com/fundraising/living heritage and getting a shirt with Lyle's sweet logo on it. And then if you are more interested in our raffle, then you can go to www.livingheritage.net/take-action, and that'll take you to the donate page for Living Heritage Research Council. And for every $10 that people donate, they are entered to win jewelry by Lyle himself. It's a really cool pendant that we'll put in the show notes, as well as a canvas framed photograph by Neil Savage, that's my dad, or a metal printed photograph from research associate Sean Kelly, among other things, like a Living Heritage Research Council pint glass with the logo that Lyle designed on it. So again, I hope that you will take a moment to support us by donating at one of those two places this week and getting either a shirt or being entered to win in our raffle. So again, that's customink.com/fundraising/livingheritage or livingheritage.net/take-action. Or if it is already past the 28th, well, obviously we're always happy to take a donation at our website, but you can also sign up for our newsletter by going to livingheritage.net to hear what we're up to, or going to Facebook and going to @Living Heritage Research Council, and that's our Facebook page, and keeping up with what we're doing there. So please, help support us, and we're really excited to see where we're going and where the tribes take us with what they'd like to do in the future. So thanks again. I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and I will speak to you all soon. Thanks for listening to the Heritage Voices podcast. You can find show notes at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/Heritage Voices. Please subscribe to the show on iTunes, Stitcher, or the Google Music Store. Also, if you like the show, please share with your friends or write us a review. If you have any questions, comments, or show suggestions, please reach out to me at jessica@livingheritageanthropology.org, or you can find me on Facebook through Living Heritage Anthropology or on Twitter @LivingHeritageA. As always, thank you to Lyle Belenqua and Jason Nez for their collaboration on our incredible logo.
This show is produced by the Archaeology Podcast Network, Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in Reno, Nevada at the Reno Collective.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more info.